Thank you. And thank you all for joining me on this Saturday morning where, oh, the sun has just come out, but it's still bloody freezing. Anyway, so I'm interested very much in how the military, the British Army, interacted with civilians in Irish urban spaces. And so this is part of the research I've been doing. There are many riots, and I've just decided to give you a taster, I suppose, in order to explain some of the ways that I think about riots and how I think they might work in a garrison town context. I am going to compare and contrast two riots today. One which resulted in dead people and one which didn't. And one produced a parliamentary report and one a coroner's court inquest that extended for 8 days. And I want to talk about the origins of violence, how sometimes it can be very difficult to disentangle violence, origins and causes from the organic nature of conflict in real time. Then there's the role of urban geography. A lot of you live in towns and cities, and you do know how the arrangement of the town and the city affects how people move through the space. And that's particularly important when it comes to conflict and riot, and how the closeness often of very old towns and cities can really act as a pressure cooker and create additional policing problems, both for the military and for the RIC. And then finally, I want to talk about how in the local newspaper coverage, how these riots are represented and interpreted at the time. And that can vary quite considerably. One of the more important aspects of newspapers in Ireland, of course, is the denominational preferences of the owners. Some of them are Catholic and some of them are Protestant. And that does often reflect in how they talk about interactions between state authorities and the civilians. But before I start, I would like to say that people do study violence between the military and the civilians quite a lot, but usually in the context of a specific time period or an event. So violence in the context of the War of Independence. And that, of course, brings with it a whole political focus and how the political relationships might manifest themselves through violent conflict on the streets. Obviously, this makes perfect sense within that historiographical methodological context. But it also means that those ways of examining it mean we're prone to making violence extremely political. Riots between military men in uniform and civilians and police were extremely common in garrison towns. Pick any time, any year, any political issue, any social issue, you could interpret it in the context of you could put that lens over these riots. But I'd like to draw back a bit and take a longer term view of it as a discrete phenomenon that might change then how we interpret the conflicts and maybe foreground some of the less political aspects. But first, I want to talk about what a garrison town actually is. Now, those of you from Kildare probably don't really need to think about it that much. This is one of the most significant garrison towns in Ireland in the sense that it is a barracks that really does dominate the urban area. And you can see the main street or the barracks on one side and the rest of the town on the other. Newbridge really grows out from an outpost, a military barracks that was constructed there because, as you can see, there's the river with the ford, because the military can water their horses easily at this point. So it's a cavalry barracks. And this particular setup here with a huge barracks on one side of the road and a town on the other is actually mimicked in Ballincollig, County Cork. So you can see that there are some towns are really focused on the barrack, and the infrastructure of the barrack creates a need for pubs, post offices, hotels, lodging houses, all kinds of things. And Newbridge in Kildare is a really good example of this. Also in Kildare, of course, you have Kildare town itself. Now, the story of the military in Kildare town is slightly more nuanced than it is in Newbridge. because this particular barrack you'll see on your screen here isn't built till 1900. And I'd like you to take a look at the shape of it compared to the Newbridge barrack. It seems to be just accommodation, whereas in Newbridge there's a square where men can maneuver and train in formation. And that really explains part of why barracks were built, was to create these squares. But by 1900, the strategic impetus for barracks has changed, so it's more an accommodation system. And Kildare Barracks represents this shift. But of course, the barracks coming to Kildare in 1900 really minimises the impact of the Curragh camp, which is so close, and which is one of the largest military stations in Britain and Ireland. So Kildare has a much more complicated and perhaps a little bit more nuanced relationship with the military by virtue of the camp, which only later really they get a barracks. And then there are other garrison towns outside of Kildare. Tipperary is also an extremely heavily garrisoned county, and this is Templemore. I have two maps here, one of the infantry barracks and one of Templemore urban district itself. And you can see that, I mean, I couldn't put them on the same map for you because the barracks is quite far out from the town. And that's a more typical arrangement than the Newbridge or Ballincollig model, where the barracks is in the centre of the town. Most great institutions like barracks, workhouses, jails or asylums are built on the periphery. And this is true of Templemore here. And Templemore, as you know, although the infantry barracks is no longer occupied by the army, it's now the training college for the Garda Síochána. And so the life of the barracks has continued really to sustain and develop the town itself economically. And Munster and Leinster really are the heart of the military garrisoning system in Ireland. Some towns even have two barracks of this scale. So Clonmel and Fermoy have two. Limerick City has 4 separate barracks and is in fact the most garrisoned urban area in the whole country. So there's an extraordinary saturation of military forces in Munster and Leinster. And some counties like Kildare and Tipperary are literally sodden with soldiers. There are so many of them, it's quite extraordinary. And there are so many soldiers, I think they've become kind of a bit invisible historiographically. In our history books, they do appear. They appear at evictions, political meetings, they police elections. There are fights over tithes, and of course they police riots that have nothing to do with them. But the military presence is rarely discussed beyond evidence of how the government enforced its authority. So I think when we look at garrison towns, it's a way to talk about the military that relegates the political situation, which is always important, but not always the central factor. It relegates that to the background and allows the social and cultural aspects of military life to emerge. And there are many facets to that. There's song, dance, there's a lot of drinking, obviously, there's marriage, there are children, there are work practices, and of course, as I'm going to talk about today, there's violence. So the first one I want to talk about, the first riot, is the Night of the Antrims, which is in 1856 in Kinsale. And the reason I've chosen this one is I want to talk about the militia as well as the regular army. So the Antrim militia, which is pictured here, these would be the officers, obviously. And behind them, I think you can see that there are tents. And the militia are often tented. They're embodied once a year and brought together for a training camp for 2 to 3 weeks. It varied. And also, of course, some of them are not embodied because of the political situation. So Tipperary militia were often not embodied because during the 19th century, Tipperary was such a disturbed county. But it does vary enormously as to when they're brought together or not. The militia are composed of men who are not professional soldiers. They're like the FCA. So they come together for training camps in the summer. And they often leave their jobs to go on, I suppose, effectively a military holiday. Some of the men who would have been in the Antrims were actually working in Glasgow, and Scottish industrial centres would leave their jobs for a few weeks and come and train with their friends. It's a very collegiate and it's very much focused on male friendships, these militia setups, because they're very local and they have an extremely strong local identity compared to regiments. And the officers that would be pictured in this are temporary also. They would have a background in military training. Often the senior man in the middle would have retired from proper army work, so to speak. And sometimes, as I said, they're tented, and sometimes they're in barracks, and sometimes it's a combination of both. And some towns have an association with particular militia. In Cork, in Mallow, they train, and also in Crosshaven. So they are moved around, and in this case, the Antrims were sent to Kinsale for July. And also, one of the things I'd like you to look at in the pictures, if you want to bear in mind their uniforms, the belts across their chests and the canes that some of the men are holding in addition to their swords. They'll feature later. These are part of the military uniform that become part of fighting. And the other important thing about the militia is they don't come with any women or children attached, because there is no provision for that within the militia system. So in Kinsale, this is the military barracks where the militia were based in 1856. Now, this is not extant anymore, so you can't go to Kinsale and find this barracks. If you go to Kinsale today, you'll go to Charles Fort or James Fort, both of which are star forts that were built much earlier than this barracks. This barracks has now been demolished and was replaced with public housing and Lidl, if you're interested in that. One of the public housing estates is called Sean-Hales Terrace, which shows you how the military identity of troopers close can be subverted or perhaps supported by a name reflecting the 1920s. So in July, the Antrims were based in this barracks, and there was a worry as the 12th of July approached that there would be trouble. The RIC brought in extra men to support the local barracks, and there was rumours that the Antrims were sympathetic to the Orange Order. The magistrates actually went so far as to meet the officers and ask them to confine their men to the barracks for the day of the 12th of July, but the officers refused. So, on the 12th of July, and this is the town itself, I'd like to draw your attention to, if you see in the red, that is the convent, the Mercy Convent, with its attached industrial school. And then we have St. Multo's Church, which is Church of Ireland, and St. John's Church, which is the Catholic Church. And the blue marking I've put in here is the constabulary barrack. So when the men are moving through the town, they start off the map in a place called World's End, which is too far away to fit on the map to show you where it is. And a party of Antrims left the pub in the World's End to travel through the town to return to their barrack. So they would be traveling along, if they were to take the normal route, along past the constabulary barrack, up through the centre of the town, past the post office, and up the hill there. So the main roads that you can see on this map. However, they didn't go that way. They decided to take the back roads and to go past the convent, the Mercy Convent, and they decided to break the windows on the way. Excuse me, I need a drink. And I think that the map shows in this case just how deliberate a choice this was. Even though there were pistis coots, they decided to take a rather roundabout way through the back streets to go home. They also then apparently passed the Catholic Church and also threw stones at it. Now, St. Multo's Church, the Church of Ireland church, was entirely unmolested. And it does look like a very sectarian thing to go this back way and then take in the opportunity to break windows. But also, of course, the way that they would have gone home the other way would have passed the constabulary barrack, and perhaps they just didn't want any trouble for being drunk. Excuse me. However, they did actually beat up a Catholic priest that they passed on the way, but they left the Church of Ireland man unmolested again. Excuse me. Now, as all of this was happening, the RIC men were not entirely silent. They left the barrack, went through these narrow streets to try and find the militiamen and to police the situation. They were unlucky. They were dispersed throughout this town and were unable to control it. So they retired to their barracks. And this is one of the main weapons that was used that night. It's a photo of a belt that's quite commonly worn on many uniforms. And the interesting thing, and the thing you have to bear in mind about all soldiers at this time, is they're not carrying any weaponry with them through the town. They have no swords, and they have no bayonets, and they have no guns. So the only thing they're armed with are belts, canes, and also the weaponry of all rioting, the stones on the road. And the stones on the road, of course, are the most frequent thing that are used at any time when there's civil disturbance. But the belt, I think, is a really interesting choice, because the belt itself is used within the barracks in informal court-martials between soldiers. So a court-martial is a military discipline system enforced by the officers, but soldiers also within their own barrack rooms have their own trials, and in order, I suppose, to express their own system of justice. And they use these belts to beat each other in these informal military punishment situations. The belt, as you can see, is white, and that was whitened with pipe clay, which was a very time-consuming, dirty, and pointless job, and was one that was really resented. And infractions about if your belt wasn't white enough meant that you would also be tried by the officers for not having the right uniform. So the belt is really an interesting and powerful object within military life and how men relate to each other. And I think it does symbolize and evoke violence all on its own. So the militia are going through the town, and they are, as I said, using belts and stones. And in the end, they have to be quelled by a picket sent from Charlesfort, which is some miles away, because the commanding officers sent a picket, which is a group of men who are always on standby to quell problems or to be called out at all times. So the Antrims did put their own picket together, but when they got to the town, they started fighting the civilians as well. So they backed up their mates effectively. So you can see how the friendships within the militia were not easily suppressed by the demands of military discipline. So the regular army had to come from Charlesfort to put the riot down. Another regiment was needed, and it was sent in the next day as well. So there was regular forces came in the next day to police Kinsale after this. And the outrage, I think, is interesting. The outrage that attended this riot. Sorry, that's the wrong slide. If I go back. This is from the Cork Examiner newspaper, which is a Catholic-owned nationalist newspaper, and which reproduced this particular ballad that was composed locally. And you can see it talks about, it is the Battle of Kinsale refought, which of course comes with all of that political baggage. And the Examiner was absolutely horrified by the whole situation and did a lot of, performative outrage. In Belfast, the Protestant-run newspapers take the opposite side and blame the Catholic locals for the fight. and the party slogans that the militia used, because they did apparently use what are called party slogans. So they referred to papists and orange men, and all of that sort of language was used on the streets at the time. So that did justify the creation of this narrative from the newspapers of different size. Now, the reaction of the army when this happened was, first of all, to draft in the regular soldiers to keep quiet, keep everything quiet. And then the Antrims were put on a boat and sent to England to finish their training. And that is fairly standard practice when anything goes wrong in a garrison town. If there's violence between a regiment or a militia, that the institutional reaction is to move them on. And really, I think that this particular conflict was partly to do with bad leadership. If the officers had taken the choice to keep their men indoors during the 12th and 13th, it's quite likely that none of this would have happened. But the officers are given great latitude to run regiments their own way. It is not a centralized system. That's one of the things that's quite interesting about the British Army. It looks very centralized and routine and fabulously bureaucratic, but in actual fact, at a local level, officers have great power to run regiments in their own way, often running them badly or making decisions that inflame local political tensions, and they're rarely reprimanded by the War Office. So in this case, that's one of those examples. Sorry, just go ahead. So the origins of the Kinsale Riot, I would say, there is, of course, the 12th of July with its political and sectarian baggage. There's drink, obviously, because these men had been in the pub all day and were extremely drunk. And then the other things that emerged in the parliamentary report, which you can find online if you can access the subscribe site, was girls, really, and what is known as bad feeling. So some weeks, I think a week before the riot itself, Antrim militiamen walking through town came across a brother and sister arguing. The brother began to beat his sister in public, and the Antrims intervened, and then a fight started between the men. So it is partly the bad feeling, partly sprung from this moment. There were other incidents where the Antrims, for example, harassed and beat a young man with intellectual disabilities, calling him a papist. So there is more than just the personal fallout. There's a lot of complicated sectarian stuff going on as well. But you can see how the sectarian stuff on its own may not have been enough to push this situation into a riot. So that's the first one I wanted to talk about. My next one is known as the affray in Shandon Street, and this is from just a few years earlier, sorry. And the reason I put this picture up, which is from Care, is because I think it's a great picture and we all should see it a lot. This shows, it's by a military artist. He has drawn his peers in the pub. And you can see the layout of a pub here, and it's really, really beautiful, with the sides of hams hanging from the ceiling, the barmaids visible quite clearly. But I think it's the way that the military artist has portrayed his comrades dressed in their absolute finery on a day out. They are so beautifully dressed by comparison with the civilian men in the photograph, who are pretty shoddy and grey and baggy clothes. These extremely tight tailored uniforms, and the very distinctive stance. The man in the middle, he has a cane switch in his hand, as you can see, once again, back to canes. And he is standing with his knee forward and his bum out, and he has a very distinctive stance that is cultivated on the parade ground. And military men were very distinctive, even in civilian clothes. They could be caught when they deserted because they walked differently, having been trained to walk and stand differently. So I think that these men really show how the glamour of the military life was seductive as well, and how these individuals can incorporate this corporate or institutional identity into their very bodies just because of the way they stand and dress. So the affray in Shandon Street, it started, it was August 1850, and there are 2 soldiers and 1 ex-soldier in a bar drinking whiskey. Quite a lot of whiskey, a couple of litres during the day. Another group arrived, and one of them was extremely drunk. The landlord refused to serve the very drunk man any spirits. He couldn't eject him, so he served him porter instead, because apparently that doesn't count as drink. The lads in the back room were chatting, and then the new party went to join them. This is when things went a bit awry. They were slagging each other off about haircuts, apparently, presumably the military issue haircuts, and insult was taken at one point. So the drunk man removed his wide leather belt and began to swing it around his head. He broke some glass and some mirrors and was thrown out of the pub along with the rest of them. So the group stood outside Alton's public house in the usual manner of drunken men everywhere, jostling and arguing. And this is about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. An RIC man coming up the road intervened, and he tried to arrest one soldier. Some of them took offense because it was the wrong soldier he was arresting. And he hit a soldier over the head with his baton. From then on, the story of what happened next, who hit who and why, is very confusing and conflicting. By the end of the day, a young boy, a civilian, was dead. 1 soldier was injured so badly that he died during the night, and the police barracks in Shandon Street had been comprehensively stoned. Every window was broken. So how did slagging over haircuts turn into hour-long altercations with hundreds of people participating? And the simple answer is we can't be sure, because riots are hard to break down into rational cause and effect consequences. They are emotional and unpredictable affairs, and I think that the coroner's court evidence really captured that conflict. So firstly, here's a slide to show you the layout of what happened. The green dot down at the bottom of your screen is the City Bridewell, the main station. The other green dot is the RIC station on Shandon Street, and the red dot is Alton's pub, Alton's Corner. So this is where the men started off the fight on this corner outside the pub, and the RIC man who accosted them was probably coming up the road from his home station. And this is a much bigger pan out of the map, and I wanted to show you this to show you where the barracks is in relation to Shandon Street, where the riot happened. This is an independence map, obviously, as you can tell from the word Collins Barracks, but the location of these buildings doesn't change just because government changes. So once the lads stumbled from the pub, right. So I'm going to talk about how once the lads stumbled from the pub, there are conflicting eyewitness accounts of what happened on Shandon Street and also on the quays below it. First off is a poor law guardian, Mr. Robert Butcher. He saw a great number of soldiers coming along Sand Quay, following a large crowd of people screeching and making a great noise. The soldiers at a distance appeared to be flinging themselves about with something in their hands. Now, Mr. Butcher, as a poor law guardian, is a respectable individual, so his account of the riot is characterized by a lot of movement. He's trying to go to the Bridewell, he's trying to find people to put it down. He's very much involved in trying to get it policed and stopped. And the interesting thing about his evidence, of course, is that Sand Quay is in fact Pine Street, because it's no longer a quay. So that shows you how names can be confusing when you compare them to physical maps. But also Pine Street is quite far away from Shandon Street. So the soldiers who were present in Alton's house or outside it have moved quite some distance from the original scene of the conflict. They may even have gone to the barracks itself to look for reinforcements. And when he saw a great number of soldiers, that is interesting because there were only about 6 or 7 men involved in the original altercation. And then the next eyewitness account is from a man who was in his shop on Shandon Street. And he's standing at the door when he sees soldiers passing his house. And this is very much the beginning of the altercation, whereas Mr. Butcher really encountered it when it had passed beyond a point of no return to a certain extent. And it's interesting how Shepherd here emphasizes the role of the civilians in provoking what happened next. So there are just 2 soldiers, but there is a mob of civilians, and they are and they're a crowd also, and they are demanding that the soldiers continue their engagement with the police. This seems to have occurred just after the men are struck by the police, but before the riot itself took hold. Now, shortly after this, Shepherd described how many people descended on the street. He shuttered his shop and watched from an upstairs window. So his is a very stationary narrative. He doesn't move. He claims he saw 4 women bringing stones to the crowd to keep them supplied with ammunition. And he also observed soldiers waving belts over heads. And his account really stresses locals as opposed to soldiers. And then the third eyewitness account is the RIC inspector. And he speaks of standing outside his barrack, which is, if you remember, Shandon Street barrack, and attempting to placate the soldiers, but then how the violence started. And he stresses the provocation of the soldiers, the absolute lack of conflict until the soldiers kicked off, but then the civilians joining in. Now, the man who was waving the belt was a soldier called Hartigan, and he's the soldier who subsequently died. And one of the more interesting things about these accounts of riots are the insults that come up in the various documents. So they are in the kind of a third person form because they're describing them in formal inquiries. So I put them into first person in order to give you an idea of what they might sound like. And as the policemen in Cork were going about their work that day, when they met soldiers, this is the sort of thing that they were facing. Some of the RIC men, from the evidence they're giving, seem to have been quite scared and quite intimidated by these experiences, one soldier or one RIC man against a group of soldiers. And the third one is an interesting one. And I was tweeting about it earlier in the week, and someone gave me a suggestion. It may come from a song, The Peeler and the Goat, in which the peeler arrests the goat, and the goat accuses him of being drunk and corrupt. So that particular insult happened a few days afterwards. There was actually an inquiry in the barrack about it, and it was really quite a serious insult by the standards of the day. And of course, the response to all of this conflict was to move the regiment to another barrack. And that is, as I said, fairly standard. And the interesting thing, I think, about this particular riot in the coverage in the newspapers is that the Examiner doesn't care about the dead soldier, but does care a lot about the dead boy. And so blames the police for the dead boy. So you can see that there are different competing narratives about whose violence is acceptable and whose violence can be overlooked. And one of the interesting aspects about the military soldiers, the military friendships, is, for example, one soldier witness said he didn't know Hartigan, but he still went to check on him in the barrack because he was wearing the uniform of his regiment. And so there's a comradeship, which, even though he doesn't know him by name, he only knows him to see, that really can sustain these kind of regimental identities. And then there are some political identities, but in this case, it doesn't seem to be an important factor. It's the 41st Regiment, by the way, from Lancashire, a Lancashire 41st Regiment. Not everyone's from Lancashire, but that's the regimental identity. And of course, then the idea of taunting and insults and the slagging off that can be humorous one moment and quite serious the next. one of the important things that really I think I need to stress about the affray in Shandon Street and in lots of these military ones, that military RIC conflicts that I've come across, is the idea that the police have to exercise forbearance. And that really focuses a lot of discussion on the weaponry they have, how they can use it, when they are allowed to use it, when it is justified, how much provocation should the police endure before they strike back. So their right to strike back in principle was never contested, but the timing and the methods used were. And the responsibilities of the police was much heavier than those borne by soldiers. Soldiers are not supervised in the same way. The police really are cast as the grown-ups in the room in these situations. I've written down age because it's quite important to note that sometimes the police are significantly older than the soldiers, and this definitely affects these physical encounters. Older men are definitely more likely to strike first. They are, of course, worried that they're going to be injured in a career-ending way. There's a lot of debate about the arbitrary and violent authority, but that, in the case of soldiers, are very much used to preemptive and extreme responses from their regimental discipline system. So I think the RIC were perhaps operating on the basis that if you strike first, you can quell the situation quite quickly. And then in the case of civilians, their response to these riots is part of their experience of day-to-day policing. So there's that background. There is the political policing context, and this is mostly where we get our illustrations, like this one here from Ennis. We get our illustrations of these riots when they're political because they make the papers and they are interesting on a national context. There's also the emotional drama of a riot. If it's a hot day, if people have been drinking, there's all sorts of things that go into that experience, and that feeds riots or causes them to dissipate sometimes. There's different roles played by men, women, and children. Women and children are very important protagonists in riots. They appear perhaps not in the meta-narrative that's put forward, but certainly within the evidence that's compiled, they're there in spades. And secondly, of course, and lastly, the idea that, there's just weaponry everywhere. The stones on the streets are available, and so they can be instant weaponry for rioting purposes. And I think that's really what I want to conclude with, is that the riots can be kicked off very suddenly, but that their presence as a phenomenon across the history of garrison towns really suggests that there's a lot we can learn from how they are policed and the dialogue between the police, civilians, and the state when these events happen. Thank you very much.